Hello, everyone, and welcome back to Real Life of Animals. Tonight's stories are not legends, rumors, or internet fiction. Every event you're about to hear is based on real documented encounters, taken from survivor accounts, local reports, and first-hand testimonies from some of the most dangerous wilderness areas on Earth. To protect the privacy and safety of those involved, names and certain identifying details have been changed. But the fear, the injuries, and the outcomes remain exactly as they happened. These are the moments when humans crossed paths with animals they were never meant to challenge. Moments where a single decision meant the difference between survival and never coming home. If you're drawn to true animal encounters, unexplained wilderness incidents, and real-life stories that prove nature does not forgive mistakes, make sure you subscribe to the channel and leave a like. It helps this channel reach more people, and it allows us to keep sharing stories that deserve to be remembered. Now turn the lights down, because once these stories begin, there's no turning back. Story 1. Alaska, a real bear attack in the deep wilderness. Alaska is not like the rest of the United States. Distance means something different there. Silence lasts longer. Help is never close. And once you step beyond the last marked road, you are no longer a visitor. You are an intrusion. This story took place in late summer when the days were still long but the nights had already begun to sharpen with cold. A small group of seasonal workers had been sent into a remote forested region outside a known fishing corridor to survey wildlife damage near an old logging route. The area was considered low risk by official standards, mostly because no recent attacks had been reported there. That assumption would later prove fatal. One of the men, we'll call him Daniel, had worked in Alaska for nearly 6 seasons. He knew the rules. He carried bear spray. He made noise when moving through dense brush. He never traveled far from the group without radio contact. Nothing about that day suggested it would be different from the hundreds of others he had spent in the wilderness. The forest was unusually quiet that morning. No birds, no distant movement. Just wind moving through thick spruce and the slow rhythmic sound of boots pressing into wet soil. Experienced Alaskan workers recognized that kind of quiet instinctively, not as peace, but as absence. Something had already cleared the area. They didn't know it yet, but they were being watched. Tracks were found later overlapping their own. Massive impressions pressed deep into the earth, partially hidden by moss and fallen needles. A large brown bear had been following them for at least 40 minutes, circling wide, staying downwind. Predatory behavior, not defensive. Daniel separated briefly from the group to inspect damaged equipment near the tree line. He was gone less than 5 minutes. When the radio crackled, his voice sounded strained, confused. He said only 3 words before the transmission cut out. "It's right here." The others ran. They found him near a shallow ravine, the ground torn apart as if something enormous had exploded out of the forest. His rifle was still strapped to his back. The bear spray had been discharged, empty, lying several feet away. Witnesses later said the bear did not flee when approached. It stood its ground at the edge of the trees, watching, assessing. Only after warning shots were fired into the ground did it retreat, disappearing into the forest with deliberate calm. Daniel survived. But survival is a technical term in Alaska. He suffered extensive injuries to his back and shoulders. crushing damage from a single bite meant to immobilize, not kill. Medical experts later confirmed the bear had applied pressure precisely. Behavior consistent with experienced predators, not startled animals. Daniel never returned to the wilderness. He later told investigators that the most terrifying moment was not the attack itself, but the realization just before it happened. The sudden understanding that he had been watched for a long time, and that the bear had chosen its moment carefully. In Alaska, bears don't always attack out of fear. Sometimes they hunt. Story 2. Alaska, the fishing camp that went silent. In western Alaska, there are fishing camps that exist only for a few months each year. They rise with the salmon runs and disappear again before winter seals the land shut. No permanent roads lead to them. Supplies arrive by float plane or boat. If something goes wrong, help is measured in hours, sometimes days. This story comes from one of those camps. The camp sat along a wide, slow-moving river bordered by dense alder and willow thickets. Bears were common there. Too common. The workers knew that. They followed protocol. Food stored away from sleeping areas, waste burned or sealed, perimeter alarms strung with bells and trip lines. But familiarity breeds a dangerous kind of comfort. The bear had been seen for weeks. A large male brown bear, scarred along the muzzle and missing part of one ear. Camp workers reported that it no longer reacted to shouting or engine noise. It watched from the tree line. It waited. Rangers later confirmed the bear had likely learned to associate camps with easy calories. On the night it happened, rain had been falling steadily since dusk. The river was loud, masking sound. Visibility dropped to almost nothing beyond the lantern light. One of the fishermen, identified here as Mark, stepped outside his cabin just after midnight to secure equipment that had come loose in the wind. He didn't carry a rifle. He didn't bring bear spray. He had done this 100 times before. The bear came from behind. There was no warning charge, no bluff. No sound except the sudden impact as Mark was knocked forward into the mud. The attack lasted less than 15 seconds. Enough time for the bear to bite once, crush, and drag. The screams woke the camp. By the time others reached the riverbank with lights and weapons, the bear was already retreating, Mark's body partially submerged near the water's edge. The bear stopped once, turned, and watched them, unafraid, before vanishing into the brush. Emergency evacuation took nearly 4 hours. Mark died before the plane arrived. Investigators later noted something deeply unsettling. The bear had avoided the food caches entirely. It had ignored the fish racks. It had gone directly for a human at night in heavy rain. Predatory behavior. The following days brought a grim discovery. Tracks revealed the bear had been circling the sleeping area for multiple nights. One set of prints passed within feet of several cabins without triggering alarms, likely stepping over lines deliberately or approaching from angles where detection was weakest. The camp was shut down permanently. Local officials quietly acknowledged that bears in the region had become dangerously habituated, no longer viewing humans as threats but as part of the environment, or worse, as prey. People who worked that camp still talk about the silence afterward. Not just the absence of machinery or voices, but the way the forest itself seemed to close in once the camp was gone, as if nothing had ever been there. In Alaska, the wilderness does not remember you for long. Story 3. Alaska, the solo hiker who was followed for miles. In interior Alaska, there are stretches of wilderness where trails exist only on paper. They are marked on maps, but on the ground they dissolve into animal paths, old survey cuts, and stretches of forest that look untouched for centuries. Experienced hikers know that once you enter these areas, you are relying entirely on your own judgment. This story comes from one of those places. The hiker, referred to here as Thomas, was not inexperienced. He had completed multiple long-distance treks across the lower 48 and had spent 2 previous summers in Alaska. He understood bear country. He carried spray, a sidearm, and a satellite communicator. His plan was simple. A 3-day solo hike following an old backcountry route used decades earlier by trappers. The first day passed without incident. On the second day, Thomas noticed something that made him uneasy. His tracks from the morning were no longer alone. Large paw prints appeared intermittently alongside his own, never directly on top of them, always offset, as if whatever was following him understood spacing. At first, he assumed coincidence. Alaska is full of bears. Paths overlap. But the pattern continued. Every time Thomas stopped to rest, the forest felt occupied. Not loud, not aggressive, just aware. He never saw the bear, but several times he caught the smell. Musky, heavy, unmistakable. By late afternoon, the terrain narrowed into a valley choked with brush. Visibility dropped to a few yards. Thomas began making deliberate noise, speaking out loud, striking trekking poles together. The response was immediate. Branches snapped behind him, not crashing, not charging, just movement. He increased his pace. What terrified him later when he replayed the experience in his mind was not the idea of being stalked, but the intelligence behind it. The bear never rushed. It never revealed itself fully. It stayed downwind. When Thomas doubled back briefly to check his surroundings, the forest went completely still. At dusk, Thomas made the decision to camp early on a raised gravel bar near a creek. Open sight lines, no dense cover. It was the safest option available. He set perimeter alarms using spare cord and metal gear. He cooked quickly and stored food far from his sleeping spot. Then he waited. The bear came after dark. The first alarm triggered just before midnight. A soft metallic clink, then another, farther away. Thomas shone his headlamp into the darkness and saw nothing. But the alarms continued to trip in a slow, deliberate sequence around the camp, circling. When the bear finally stepped into the edge of the light, Thomas described it as unimpressed. A massive brown bear, calm, head low, ears forward. It did not react to shouting. It did not flinch when Thomas fired a warning shot into the air. The bear took one step closer. Thomas deployed bear spray. The cloud hit the bear's face at close range. For a moment it worked. The bear backed off, shaking its head violently, retreating into the darkness. Thomas did not sleep. He sat with his weapon ready until dawn. At first light, he packed immediately and began moving, fast. Less than an hour later, he found fresh tracks ahead of him. The bear had circled around during the night and repositioned. That realization broke him. Thomas activated his satellite beacon before the situation could escalate further. Rescue arrived by helicopter later that day. From the air, responders confirmed seeing the bear emerge from the tree line as the helicopter approached, watching, not fleeing. The incident report classified it as a non-contact predatory encounter. Thomas never returned to solo hiking in Alaska. He later said the most disturbing part wasn't the danger. It was the sense that the bear had been deciding something, weighing options, and that at some point he might have been chosen. In Alaska, not all threats announce themselves. Some simply walk behind you and wait. Story 4. Alaska, the remote cabin where the bear wouldn't leave. There are thousands of remote cabins scattered across Alaska. Some were built by trappers decades ago. Others belong to hunters, surveyors, or families who wanted a place so far from everything else that silence became a feature, not a problem. Many of these cabins sit empty for most of the year, visited only seasonally. This story comes from one such cabin deep in a forested region far from any permanent settlement. The man staying there, identified here as Robert, was in his early 50s. He had lived in Alaska most of his life and considered himself cautious, not reckless. He had spent previous winters alone in similar cabins without incident. Bears were part of the landscape, but by late autumn most had moved to lower activity levels. That year, one had not. Robert arrived at the cabin in early October to prepare it for winter. Snow had not yet settled, but temperatures dropped sharply at night. The first evening passed quietly. He secured food, locked the door, and made a fire. Sometime after midnight, he heard something heavy move outside. At first, he assumed it was wind or falling branches. Then the cabin shook, not violently, just enough to be intentional. Something large brushed against the wall. He heard breathing, slow, deep, close enough that it vibrated through the logs. Robert froze. He waited. The sound moved along the cabin's exterior, circling once, then stopping near the door. He heard claws scrape lightly against the wood. Not scratching to get in, testing. At dawn, he stepped outside cautiously. The ground was torn up. Massive tracks surrounded the cabin, overlapping in places where the animal had paced back and forth. The door frame bore shallow gouges. A large brown bear had spent the night there. Robert considered leaving immediately, but decided against it. Weather was moving in, and travel would be dangerous. He convinced himself the bear had moved on. It had not. The bear returned the following night. This time it pushed against the door hard enough to bow the wood inward. Robert fired a warning shot through a side window. The bear retreated, but only a short distance. From inside, Robert could hear it moving just beyond the tree line, breaking branches, occasionally huffing. The behavior was not defensive. The bear wasn't startled. It was persistent. By the third night, Robert was exhausted. He had slept in short bursts, weapon always within reach. When darkness fell again, the bear arrived earlier than before. It struck the cabin wall once, hard, then began circling. Then something changed. The bear stopped moving. Silence settled so completely that Robert could hear his own breathing. He waited for minutes that felt like hours. Then he heard it, scraping. Not at the door, not at the walls, under the cabin. The bear was digging. Panic set in. The cabin stood on low supports driven into soil that was not frozen yet. Robert knew if the bear compromised the structure, there would be nowhere to run. He activated his emergency beacon. Rescue crews later said his transmission was calm but strained. He described the sounds, the pressure against the cabin, the certainty that the animal had not given up. A helicopter reached him just before dawn. As it approached, the crew spotted the bear emerging from the trees, standing on its hind legs briefly to watch the aircraft. It did not flee immediately. After Robert was evacuated, wildlife officers investigated the site. They confirmed the bear had been returning repeatedly, showing classic signs of predatory fixation rather than territorial defense. Why it targeted the cabin specifically was unclear. No food was found improperly stored. Sometimes in Alaska, bears investigate structures simply because something inside is alive. The cabin was later dismantled. Robert never returned to live alone in the wilderness again. He said the worst part was not the fear of being attacked, but the realization that something outside had decided the cabin itself was an obstacle, not a boundary. Story 5. Alaska, the mining trail that turned into a feeding ground. In Alaska, abandoned mining trails are some of the most dangerous places a person can walk. They cut deep into bear territory, often following rivers and valleys rich with food sources. Unlike hiking routes, these trails were never meant for safety. They exist because heavy machinery once moved through them, and when the machines left, the wilderness reclaimed everything. This story comes from one of those forgotten corridors. The incident occurred during a short summer contract involving a small mineral survey team. 4 men were flown into a remote region to assess whether reopening an old mining site would be viable. The trail leading to the site hadn't been used in nearly 2 decades. Overgrown brush, collapsed wooden bridges, and washed-out sections made progress slow. The men were warned about bears before deployment. They carried rifles. They carried spray. They followed spacing rules while walking. What they did not realize was that the trail itself had become part of a bear's routine. Evidence later showed that a large brown bear had been using the path regularly, likely because it offered easier movement through dense forest and access to multiple food sources along the river bends. On the second day, the group noticed carcass remains near the trail. Fish bones, torn hides from smaller animals, signs of feeding, not scavenging. One of the men suggested altering the route. They didn't. Late that afternoon, the group split briefly to document separate sections of the site. One of the surveyors, referred to here as Michael, lagged behind to photograph collapsed support beams near the edge of the forest. The attack happened without warning. The bear emerged from uphill cover using gravity and terrain to close distance silently. There was no bluff charge, no roar, just sudden impact. Michael was knocked to the ground and bitten once across the shoulder and neck area. The bite did not tear. It crushed. The bear pinned him, applied pressure, then released. The rest of the group heard the sound seconds later. When they reached him, the bear was still there, standing several yards away, watching. One of the men fired a shot into the dirt between them and the bear. It stepped back, but did not run. Only after sustained shouting and a second warning shot did it retreat into the trees. Michael was alive but critically injured. His breathing was shallow. Blood loss was severe. The emergency call went out immediately, but extraction took time. Weather delayed the helicopter for nearly 3 hours. During that time, the bear returned twice, not charging, not aggressive, just approaching the perimeter, testing distance, retreating again. Rescue personnel later described this as one of the clearest cases of a bear exhibiting feeding site behavior around humans. The animal did not see the group as a threat. It saw them as competitors intruding on a familiar route. Michael survived after extensive surgery. Doctors later stated that the bear's restraint, biting once and disengaging, likely saved his life. A full attack would have been fatal. Wildlife officers tracked the bear days later. It was euthanized after continuing to approach human activity areas along the same trail. The mining project was abandoned. Workers who had used the trail for years admitted something chilling afterward. They had grown used to seeing bears in the distance, assuming coexistence meant safety. In Alaska, it doesn't. A bear that tolerates your presence is often far more dangerous than one that flees. Idaho, Story 6. Alaska, the river crossing. No one was supposed to survive in Alaska. Rivers are lifelines. They are used for travel, fishing, supply routes, and survival. But they are also borders, natural corridors where bears hunt, feed, and defend territory with brutal efficiency. Crossing one in bear country is never routine, no matter how many times it has been done before. This story comes from a river crossing that went catastrophically wrong. The incident occurred in late August during peak salmon movement. Bears were active everywhere. Locals knew this, but seasonal workers often underestimated how aggressively bears control river access during feeding periods. A small crew of 3, 2 contractors and 1 local guide, were returning to their temporary base after completing equipment checks upstream. Their route required crossing a wide, shallow section of river that was normally considered safe during daylight hours. It was early evening. Light was fading. The river was loud. That mattered more than they realized. As the first man crossed, he noticed movement upstream, large shapes moving in and out of the water. Bears, at least 2, possibly more. They paused on the bank, watching. The guide immediately told them to stop. They were already too far in. The bear that attacked came from downstream. Witnesses later said it surfaced from the water like something unreal, massive, soaked, silent. It closed the distance in seconds, using the current to mask sound and movement. By the time anyone reacted, it was already on the second man, identified here as Aaron. The impact knocked Aaron off his feet and dragged him partially underwater. The bear bit down on his leg and hip, shaking violently. Water turned dark almost instantly. The other 2 screamed, fired warning shots, and deployed spray, but the river current carried most of it away. The bear released Aaron only when another bear approached from the opposite bank. Competition. The first bear backed away reluctantly, standing chest deep in water, staring at the injured man. The second bear moved closer, assessing. Neither fled. The guide did the only thing he could. He entered the river. Against every survival instinct, he moved toward Aaron, firing his weapon into the water between them and the bears. The sound echoed off the valley walls. Finally, one bear retreated into the brush. The other lingered, watching before following. Aaron was pulled to shore, barely conscious. His injuries were catastrophic. Deep bite wounds, crushed bone, severe blood loss, hypothermia setting in rapidly due to immersion. They applied pressure, wrapped him in spare gear, and activated emergency rescue. The helicopter arrived nearly an hour later. Rescue crews later stated that if the attack had lasted even 10 seconds longer, Aaron would have died in the river. Bears often kill by dragging prey underwater to drown them. This one had already begun that process. Aaron survived, but survival came at a cost. He lost mobility in one leg permanently. Nerve damage was extensive. Doctors later said the pattern of injury strongly indicated predatory intent rather than defensive behavior. Wildlife officers investigated the area in the following days. Tracks, disturbed riverbanks, and feeding remains confirmed that the bears had been actively hunting along that crossing point for weeks. The route was quietly removed from official travel recommendations. The guide who entered the river resigned from field work shortly after. He later said the most haunting detail wasn't the violence. It was the way the bear watched from the water afterward, calm and unhurried, as if deciding whether to return. In Alaska, rivers do not belong to people. They belong to whatever is strong enough to claim them. Story 7. Alaska, the night the campfire stopped working. There is a belief among people who spend time in bear country that fire creates safety. Light, noise, and human presence are thought to be enough to keep large predators at a distance. In many places, that belief holds true. In Alaska, it sometimes fails completely. This incident occurred in a remote interior region, where a temporary research camp had been established near a wide clearing surrounded by dense forest. The team consisted of 4 people documenting seasonal wildlife movement. They were experienced, well-equipped, and familiar with bear protocols. The camp had been active for nearly 3 weeks without serious incident. Bears had been seen nearby, but never close. On the night it happened, the weather was unusually still. No wind, no rain. The kind of quiet that makes sound carry farther than expected. The team gathered around the campfire after dinner, talking casually, cleaning equipment, and preparing to turn in for the night. That's when the forest went silent. One of the researchers, identified here as Laura, noticed it first. She mentioned that she hadn't heard insects or birds for several minutes. No one reacted immediately. Silence in Alaska is common. Then they heard footsteps, not crashing through brush, not running. Slow, deliberate movement just beyond the firelight. The sound stopped whenever someone turned to look. A bear emerged at the edge of the clearing. It was a large brown bear, its coat darkened with old scars and dirt. It did not hesitate when it saw the fire. It did not react to voices. It stepped forward once, calmly, as if evaluating distance. Someone shouted. The bear stopped, but did not retreat. One of the team fired a warning shot into the air. The sound echoed sharply, but the bear only shifted its weight, lifting its head slightly, eyes reflecting the firelight. What followed was not a charge. The bear sat down. It sat at the edge of the clearing and watched. For nearly 10 minutes, no one moved. The fire crackled. Smoke drifted upward. The bear remained still, ears forward, breathing slow. Rangers later described this behavior as highly unusual, neither defensive nor startled. Predatory patience. When the bear finally stood, it moved not toward the food storage area, but toward the sleeping tents. That's when panic broke. The team shouted, fired another warning shot, and deployed bear spray. The cloud reached the bear, and this time it reacted, backing away quickly into the trees. No one slept that night. They kept the fire burning until dawn, taking turns on watch. At first light, they packed immediately and prepared to leave. As they loaded equipment, they found tracks surrounding the camp, circling patterns overlapping in places where the bear had approached within a few feet of the tents. The bear had returned during the night. It had simply stayed out of sight. Rangers later confirmed the bear had been exhibiting learned behavior around campsites, likely associating human presence with eventual opportunity rather than danger. The campfire, once a deterrent, had become irrelevant. The camp was shut down early. Laura later said the most disturbing part wasn't the bear's size or lack of fear. It was the way it waited, as if it understood that time, not force, would eventually work in its favor. In Alaska, there are moments when the wilderness doesn't rush you. It just watches and waits for you to make a mistake. Story 8. Alaska, the riverbank where no one heard him scream. The last story takes place in southeastern Alaska, in a region shaped by rivers rather than mountains. Here, the forest grows thick and low, tangled with alder and moss, and the rivers move slowly, wide, brown, and deceptively quiet. Locals say these riverbanks are some of the most dangerous places in the state, not because of visibility, but because bears learn to hunt there without being seen. The victim in this case is referred to as Daniel. Daniel was a seasonal worker in his early 30s, hired to assist with river surveys during salmon migration. He was not inexperienced. He had spent 2 previous summers in Alaska and understood the basics of bear safety. He carried spray. He made noise. He followed protocol. On the day of the attack, he was working alone. This was not unusual. The assignment required walking several miles along the riverbank, stopping at marked points to record fish activity and water conditions. Radio check-ins were scheduled every 2 hours. Daniel checked in on time at noon. He reported nothing unusual. That was the last time anyone heard his voice. Around 2:30 p.m., his supervisor attempted another radio check. No response. At first, it wasn't alarming. Terrain interference was common. Another call followed, then another, still nothing. A search team was assembled by late afternoon. They followed Daniel's planned route along the river, moving carefully, watching for tracks. About a mile from the last checkpoint, they found his equipment bag lying near the water's edge. It was unopened. Bear tracks were visible nearby, large overlapping prints pressed deep into the wet soil. The ground showed signs of disturbance, but not a struggle. No blood, no torn clothing. The silence along the river was absolute. Searchers later said the most unsettling detail was how normal everything looked. No chaos, no clear violence, just absence. They continued downstream. 200 yards later, they found drag marks leading into dense brush. The vegetation was bent low, branches broken inward as if something heavy had passed through repeatedly. They did not call out. In Alaska, trained teams know when not to. Daniel's remains were found partially concealed beneath mud and debris near a bend in the river. Rangers later determined the attack had been sudden and close range. There were no signs he had deployed his spray. No evidence he had time to react. The bear involved was believed to be a large brown bear that had been frequenting the river during peak salmon season. Witness reports from nearby camps suggested the bear had become increasingly bold, tolerating human presence at closer distances than normal. Investigators concluded Daniel likely surprised the bear at extremely close range while rounding a bend in the riverbank. In such situations, attacks happen in seconds. There is rarely sound. No screams were reported by nearby workers, no radio transmission, no warning, just quiet. The bear was later tracked and euthanized after continuing to approach human areas. Examination confirmed involvement in the attack. For Daniel's co-workers, the hardest part wasn't the loss. It was the realization that he had followed every rule. He had done what he was supposed to do. He had experience, he had equipment, and still, Alaska took him. Rangers closed that section of river for the remainder of the season. Today, the river looks unchanged. Water flows, salmon return, Bears still move along the banks unseen until they choose otherwise. And somewhere along that bend, the forest holds the memory of a moment that passed without sound, without witnesses, and without mercy. In Alaska, danger does not always announce itself. Sometimes it waits beside the water. And by the time you realize it's there, no one hears a thing.